tried to delay the freedom for the enslaved people until the debts could be paid off. But he also sought a ruling from the court in the state of Virginia, and he received a ruling actually in December of 1862. At the same time he was fighting the Battle of Fredericksburg. And immediately afterwards he wrote to his wife that the ruling was to free them as soon as possible, and he would begin the writing of the manumission papers. So that was in December of 1862. The date in which it would take effect was December 29th. Right, so that was 5 years. For the enslaved people, that was a long time. And many were unhappy. They thought they were being lied to, that they were being deceived, that Robert E. Lee was not carrying out the terms of Mr. Custis's will, that they thought they were supposed to be freed immediately upon his death, and they weren't being freed, and he was hiring people out to pay off the family debts. And they thought they were, as far as they knew, they couldn't trust Lee. They didn't know if they'd ever see their relatives again, so they were concerned. And so there became a lot of unrest here. A lot of unrest, a lot of tension. Mrs. Lee wrote at one point she felt the place was on the verge of a rebellion. And so Lee ultimately did carry out the terms of the will. You could say that he was legally bound to do that. He was. It's ironic to some degree that he did that while serving as a general in the Confederate Army. But nonetheless, he carried out the terms of that will in December of 1862. Yes, real quick, and then I want to get to Dr. Crew.
Were any of the enslaved here on the plantation freed once this became occupied by the federal United States Union?
Well, that's a good question. Were any of the enslaved people free here once the U.S. Army took over? And arguably, yes. In a sense, they all were. They all had the opportunity to immediately become free if they wanted. They could pack up whatever meager possessions they had and head north and hope to be protected by the U.S. government. However, were they technically or legally free is a different matter. And then it becomes debatable, because when you look at the history of how people became free, you realize that it was a very complex thing. The Emancipation Proclamation wasn't all that it is claimed to have been, for example. Did it actually free people? Or, well, yes, but for the term of the war. But did it actually free anyone? Because once the war was over, would they remain free?
Virginia was a state in rebellion.
Virginia was a state in rebellion. But once Virginia was returned to the Union and was under the U.S. Constitution once again completely, the U.S. Constitution made it a lot more complicated. Because without amending the Constitution, no slave could be freed by the U.S. government. That was the importance of the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime measure. And if the 13th Amendment was not quickly passed by the House of Representatives and ultimately ratified, arguably almost 3.5 to 4 million people would have been returned to slavery as soon as the South was defeated. Because again, slavery was protected by the Constitution. Unless the Constitution was amended, no one was set free. But in this case, they could be freed by their master according to the terms of the state law of Virginia. And that's how this was executed. So there were nearly 200 people, 63 people here, but 196 people total, and the 2 other plantations included, who were set free by the terms of will. December 29, 1862. I'll be glad to speak with any of you more after Dr. Crew, but I do not want to step on his, or intrude on his time anymore. So let me introduce you to Dr. Spencer Crew. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry to break up the conversation.
Well,
I was asked to talk a little bit about slave marriages, and and how this particular marriage fit into a larger context of understanding the life of married enslaved people. First of all, what a powerful ceremony to watch. It must have been a very unique moment for both Mariah and for Charles in terms of having a chance to actually have a ceremony with the minister, have a chance to do it in Arlington House itself, in this parlor. As it was mentioned later on, her half-sister would have the same space, and to have a formal ceremony take place where their vows are recognized, they're able to publicly share their affection and their love for one another in a very public, well-recognized fashion. And I'm sure for them, they felt the same way that this was a special occasion, a very unique occasion, and that in many ways this was a different kind of experience than many other enslaved people that they knew about had as well. And I think that's what we need to begin to think about, is that in fact, this ceremony, this experience for them was a very unique one in the larger picture of the life of enslaved people. Because in fact, the chance to be married itself is a very unique opportunity to have happen. Because in many instances, a marriage formally taking place was not part of the process in terms of African-American enslaved men and women working together. In fact, economically, marriage was an interesting phenomenon, but clearly not an important one in terms of the operation and the economics of a population of enslaved people. Because for many slave masters and slavers, it was not so much an interest in people getting married and husband and wives living together in a family. What was much more interesting, much more important, was the children that resulted as a consequence of this marriage and this coming together. Because for them, economically, children were an important part of that process of success of that plantation. Because children represented the next generation of workers, the next generation of laborers. So at minimum, it meant that you had more people coming along who could work in the fields and allow the plantation to continue to be successful. Or it allowed you another individual that you had under your control who you might be able to in fact sell to make a profit from it. And sometimes people think, well, that's really not that important, really not an important part of what goes on in this plantation. But let me have you think about this in a different kind of way. I'm sure all of you know that in the beginning, as Virginia got started, the primary crop was tobacco. Tobacco was very popular in Europe and other places, and the land was fertile, and there's plenty of it here in Virginia, so tobacco became the primary crop for the state, or colony at the time. Well, what happens is the problem with tobacco is that it really begins to undermine the fertility of the soil. And over time, as you have more and more crops from the same soil, it kills its ability to have more crops. So over the years, as tobacco was mined almost exclusively and intensively, the land began to suffer. And your ability to have successful tobacco crops begins to lessen. So what happens is that Virginia has to begin to look to other kinds of crops, other kinds of things to grow. Some people have argued that when the Quakers came here from Pennsylvania, they brought with them a different kind of farming approach. Mostly grains and wheat and things like that was what they grew there. So that became more and more the crop of value, the cash crop for Virginia going forward. So as you transition from the 1700s to the 1800s, more and more wheat and grains become your primary crop. Well, this has a consequence. You do not need the same intensity, the same number of laborers to take care of wheat and grain as you need to take care of tobacco. So what begins to happen in Virginia is that the need for large numbers of workers begins to diminish. So you might ask me, so I said before that children as labor were important. How does this make it important for Virginia? Well, one key reason is that while Virginia didn't need new labor, there was this other crop that came into importance with the creation of the cotton gin. And cotton becomes the cash crop, not for Virginia, but for other states in the deeper south, Alabama, Mississippi. And sugar cane, Louisiana, is also an important crop. They cannot get enough labor. They need it as much as possible. In fact, you have sons of Virginians who move out that way to make their fortune because trying to survive here is more and more difficult. So that the demand for labor there, combined with the ending of the African slave trade in 1808, means that there wasn't enough labor further south to take care of the needs to take care of these crops. So what happens is that Virginia, with this excess of labor, becomes a net slave exporting state. That those labor they did need was sold for profit here, and then resold in the Deep South for greater profit. So there is an incentive here in Virginia to continue to have a burgeoning labor force as a way of continuing to make a profit, especially as tobacco becomes less profitable. And wheat and other grains also have fluctuating value in terms of the worldwide market. So that labor, in terms of children, becomes a very important part of this. So for many slaveholders, the idea of a marriage was an interesting concept, but really not one of importance. What was more important was to get women and men together and children to issue from that union. And so they approached it in a different kind of way. Many slaveholders felt that the marriage wasn't even important. In fact, what they wanted to see was more children produced, so they would use other kind of devices to get to that stage. It wasn't unusual on some plantations for the slaveholder to pick out the largest, the strongest, the most muscular male slave, and to mate him with a number of women. Not allowing them to find the person that they love, but to mate with this man, believing that it would result in strong laborers that would be good for sale for later. If they didn't take this path, the other thing they might do is just decide for couples who you're going to marry. They might say, well, you look very likely, you look strong, and you look like you'd be a good producer, you two marry. You don't love each other? Doesn't matter to me. What I need is children. So the idea is then how do they connect them together to create the kind of children, the kind of labor force that they wanted. So you can imagine that Mariah and Charles were thinking we're very fortunate in this instance that at least we're able to choose for ourselves what we want to have happen. As a consequence, with these choices taking place, when you had the chance, in fact, to choose your mate, or at least to select someone, it was a unique occasion. But even then, there was a lot of negotiation that had to go on. If you wanted to marry someone, first of all, your slave or your slaver had to approve. If he said or if she said no, there's no appeal. You just have to find somebody else or just make do with the way that things are. And as you made this request, you had to also understand what were the rules that your particular slaveholder had in place. They might suggest that you could only marry someone on this plantation. You weren't allowed to marry someone down the street, down the road, on another plantation, only on this plantation. And they would do this in part because they didn't want any confusion about who those children belonged to. Because if you were to marry someone on another plantation, the question then becomes, so whose children do they belong to? And we know by law that the children follow the state of their mother, so if the mother's enslaved, they're enslaved. But it wasn't quite as clear about who controlled the destiny of that child. Was it the owner of the mother, the owner of the father? So to avoid that, we would say you can only marry someone on our plantation and nowhere else. Well, that also became problematic because if you're on a smaller place over the years, it became harder and harder to find someone to marry who might not be a family relative. And that also becomes a challenge. So these things become part of the process. The other problem that I was facing in terms of thinking about this was not only would you have to marry someone on your own plantation, if you didn't and you found someone on the other plantation, you still had to then get the two slave owners to come together and to negotiate how this is going to work. They might have to decide who the children belong to, or they might have to decide whether or not we're going to let this happen at all. Sometimes what they say is that what we're going to do is I'm going to sell you to the other person, and that way we solve this problem. And therefore, there's no issue about who the children belong to. The other idea is that you allow the marriage to take place, and then they keep control of the individuals, but they allow one of the individuals to come and visit the other one at certain times during the week or during the year. You'd have to get a pass from the slaveholder, and then you'd be allowed to travel from one place to the other to stay with your family. The amount of time you can stay together varied pretty widely. It could be, you could come maybe twice a week, sometimes you could come on Wednesday. Most often they would come on the weekends. You might, after you finish your work on Saturday afternoon, you might stay all the way over to Sunday night and have to return back to work. I've also read in some of the slave narratives where, in fact, the father was taken so far away he only had to see his family once a year. But it was still considered to be a marriage. Now, the enslaved had a name for these kind of marriages. They called them abroad marriages or traveling marriages, because you weren't there all the time. You had to travel back and forth. But I think the feeling was that at least there was a marriage. At least there was someone you connected to. That had value. And people found it very important to have. So that these traveling marriages were important. but also a different form of living together. Again, you can imagine that Mariah and Charles were feeling very positive and very good about the fact that they were on the same plantation, they were married, they lived together, and they didn't have to have an abroad marriage, the kind of negotiating marriage that would take place. Now, the other thing that's unusual is to have a marriage ceremony itself. And very often there wasn't a marriage ceremony. That you come, you get permission and say, fine, go on. And there was no formal ceremony. Now, if there wasn't a formal ceremony, it certainly wasn't as ornate as this one. Very often it might only be officiated by a well-respected member of the enslaved community who would say a few words and allow you to go off and get married. Or you might even have the slaveholder himself officiate over by saying a few words and then allowing you to consider yourselves married. Now, one of the traditions that we now continue to keep during this period, if you have a more formal ceremony, even less formal ones, is the idea of jumping the broom. I think you all have heard about that. And what we have learned is that this emerges out of African culture, common culture. And the broom represents sweeping aside the past, sweeping aside evil spirits. So the broom means a clean beginning, a new beginning for that group. The jumping the broom is an idea that whoever jumps highest is to be the boss of the family. So next time you watch the wedding, see who jumps highest. The idea was that the male was just a little bit stronger, jump a little higher, but didn't always happen. I read one narrative where, in fact, that happened. The woman jumped higher, and everyone laughed, had a good time. It turns out she was the boss. So maybe this works very well. But so these kind of ceremonies, it wasn't usual to have a very elaborate one. But I think among the enslaved, they found touches to use with it to make sure that, in fact, they had some impact on it and were able to sort of come together to allow these things to happen. So you have a wedding ceremony, and you have this connection taking place. Well, what follows then is interesting, because again, very likely you didn't have much of a celebration follow. You'd be pronounced husband and wife, and then go off. But we expect you to be at work right early the next day, or work right early the next time that we come together. So that honeymoon as such is sort of fit in a very tight, narrow period of time, and was a part and parcel of a long part of it. The other thing I think that was very challenging for them was understanding that as you came out of this marriage and you had a chance to come together, understand that marriage was very important to the enslaved. That connection with a family member, to have a family, with children, to have someone to share your life with them was valued. And you can see this better after the Civil War. Many people who had been separated came back together trying to find each other to renew these marriages and bring them back together. So that even while the ceremony and the way it's perceived by the enslaved person was not as strong, for those who were involved in these marriages, it was a very important part of life. The other thing I think we want to keep in mind connected with this ceremony and these occasions is that even with Mariah and Charles, after the wedding, it wasn't clear what their future might be like. That the reality is that now you found someone to whom you feel very strongly, to whom you want to share your life with. Control of that life is not yours. And it might change at any minute in any circumstance. Because as much as you are perceived as human beings, you are also perceived as property. And as a consequence, as property, you were saleable. You could be sold, and the profits used for a variety of kinds of things. So that enslaved couples were not ever sure about how steadfast, how long that marriage, that coming together was going to last. Because any change might alter that connection. If the slaveholder on that plantation fell into deep debt, he might decide he needs to sell someone in order to cover that debt. Very often, it didn't matter if it was your child or your husband or your wife. If they needed the money, they would make that choice. And splitting up families was not at all unusual. In fact, it was the most common thing to happen for enslaved families, is to lose a member of the family one way or the other. Some of the most heartbreaking things I've read about enslaved families is listening to mothers with young children being separated from those children. And they talk about the pleading that mothers would have to the person who purchased it, please bring my baby with me. And they'd say, no, I don't need that. And we're hearing the separation taking place. That is a very powerful concern that was part and parcel of the experience of those who were enslaved, who got married, of Mariah and Charles. They were fortunate in the sense that she was free, they were able to have a parcel of land. But for many, that didn't always the case. You were expected to go back to work, and you were never sure about what the future might hold. The other thing of great concern for the enslaved was the death of the slave owner, because that put everything into chaos. And yet everything that had operated before changes, and you've got to figure out what the new circumstance is. And very often what that death meant was that the individual often had debts, owed people money, and those debts had to be paid off. And it didn't always divvy up equally that a whole person provided enough coverage for that debt. So again, you have sales as a way of paying off those debts in order to take care of the things that the slave owner had acquired. The other problem is that you also didn't have heirs who expect to get their portion of the estate. And again, that's not a clean kind of thing. And it didn't mean that whole families would get pointed and sent to one place or another. It could mean that a husband went one place, a mother went another place, and the children went someplace else. And it might depend upon who was the favorite of the child of the slaveholder, of the wife, or even of the relatives who had claim on that group. So that these were constant concerns that I think worried those who were enslaved in terms of what the future might be like. The last piece that I want to point to in terms of those ongoing concerns is the fact that you have no control over your own body. You have no control over what happens to those who are part of your family. I think the one thing that a parent always wants to be able to do is to protect their children, to provide them with some kind of bubble of protection that allows them to be safe. Well, that doesn't exist in an enslaved family, because the hierarchy would be the child, the parent, the overseer, and then the slave owner. So that if, in fact, you did something to make the overseer unhappy, to make the slave owner unhappy, or his family unhappy, his wife unhappy, they could punish you. And all you could do as that spouse, all you could do as a parent is stand and watch that take place. And to watch them to watch a husband take 100 stripes, or a wife to take 50 stripes, or a child to be beaten mercilessly with a switch. You had no control over that. So as this wedding takes place, and as Mariah and Charles, I think, had this very special occasion, I'm sure there's also some worry around life, worrying about what the future might hold. And for other enslaved couples, for who got married and came together, that same worry was compounded even more than it was for Charles. Now, this is not to say that the marriage was not important. It's not to say that the wedding and coming together are two important things, because what was valued was one to have a life mate to live with. Someone after a long, difficult day, you could sit down and talk with. Children could grab her around you and hold and love, and they could love you back. And you read a lot about how strong and how important those connections were among those who were enslaved. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that with the power and the wonderful aspects connected with the marriage of the enslaved, there's all this other uncertainty that goes with it. So that the story is one of the good and the bad. And as we celebrate their marriage, as we celebrate, I think, this very special occasion for Mariah and Charles, we also have to keep in mind the challenges that they faced, and more importantly, the challenges that other enslaved people faced when they too decided to get married and come together. That if the future was different, the future might be better, but the future also might be very painful. It's a very uneven kind of future that lay before them. So these are things that I like to think about when you think about this ceremony. Enjoy it. I think appreciate the moment for Mariah and Charles, but also understand that the future itself can be very challenging and may have heartbreak for it. Yes.
Oh, I'm just late. I'm going to shoot the ball, but I have
Let's see, how can I say this? Mariah and my ancestor are first cousins, so they're both the children of George Washington Parke Custis. But they took different paths in terms of the wedding. Now, Mariah was married here. My ancestor, Lucy, was married at Christ Church, because, and I found all this out. Even the church didn't seem to know, didn't have this history, but I uncovered it by accident, you know. So it's interesting. I'm thinking that there were two minds there. Now, Lucy, through my ancestor Caroline, who is my grandmother to the 7th generation, they were all raised pretty much at Mount Vernon. So I think that when they were brought in, Caroline was brought here, the mindset, I think, was she wanted to follow the Episcopal Church and be part of the new movement to have eventually an African American body and congregation be a part of that. That's just what I'm thinking, because the whole family has remained Episcopalian, and I think that's sort of where she was going with that. But certainly, Lucy was married there. All the children were, baptized there. Caroline was, what is it called, confirmed there, and she died and was buried there in Christ Church. So it's kind of two different ways of looking at it. And I'm wondering to myself, what do you know about the fact that some of the enslaved people may have been wanting to be a part of the new community? Because listen, they knew, or they should have known, I'm sure, that one of the ways that the children were acknowledged was not by name, but early release. There was an early release program, and so they.
One way to describe it.
An early release program. So some of them, and I think Caroline knew she was going to eventually be, released, or her children would be early, which they were. So I'm just wondering, what do you know about that?
I don't know a lot about the Episcopalian Church.
Or just any church that might have been connected.
What I know most about, at least understand, is more the rise of the Baptist Church and the Methodist Church. Because part of what was their argument is that everyone had souls that were equal. And in the larger philosophy, it meant everyone had some equality. And what happens over the years is that the Southern Baptist Church and the Southern Methodist Church pushes that to one side. But if you talk about the early camp meetings that were taking place across the South, enslaved people and African Americans were going to those in large numbers because what they were espousing was equality among the groups.
Was that after slavery, you saying?
No,
Or during?
that's before slavery.
So they were allowed to, how did they just kind of pass, I guess?
They pass, sometimes they go over, from Saturday to Sunday they might go, sometimes they just went where they're supposed to. And that's part of the reason why the Southern Baptist Church became back in Nixon, because it was not offering the kind of philosophy that supported the institutions. The Episcopalian Church, I just don't know about to agree.
I think that just happened as a factor of General Washington. And, was the George Washington Park Custis also Episcopalian? So then that's probably what about it.
Yes. Mariah and Charles had 10 children, and their offspring. We've kind of made marks in the community. I'll just say been active in the community. The sister, the half sister, what kind of like their families now? I think they were saying something about. Somewhere I read that some of the offspring did not make it or something, or I'm talking about Mariah's sister. I think she had 6 kids. Mariah had 10 kids. Are their families a lot known about their family now? Like how Craig is active here with the Arlington House. Does anybody know what was her sister's name?
Talking about the Lee?
Yeah, those 6.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Right there. You know much about them?
I don't know. Can you say anything?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the Lees were certainly prominent after the war. All the children are there except for one who dies during the war. And many, for instance, prominent in the sense that a lot of the artifacts that are at Mount Vernon today were given by the Lees to Mount Vernon. So they kept custody of many of the artifacts from Mount Vernon. And you can find descendancy charts of the Lee family. I don't think they have a particularly high profile publicly, but they're known to one another, and some are married to other people who've been from. I mean, for instance, if I throw out a name, there's a Bowman's Distillery that's in Fredericksburg. I think one of the Lee descendants married into that family. and Burke and Herbert Hay. One of them was a Lee family member. Again, I don't know the full details.
So have they come back for this for the well, not this one, but for the centennial celebration?
Centennial celebration?
I thought this was part of the Park Services centennial celebration.
No, not that I know of.
Okay.
I mean, the Arlington House is certainly in contact with some Lee family members. Matt can speak more directly to this than I can. But generally, they have a low profile. I've never really been introduced to a Lee family member coming in and saying,
Okay.
we're so happy to see you here today.
Okay.
But they're around.
I wanted to ask a question. You mentioned about their debt.
Yes.
How did they have debt? Were they paid money?
Because George Washington
I'm talking about Custis family.
and his family are related to
No, that was a
black. They have a black son.
Debts to pay off.
No, that means slave, I meant the slave holders.
Yes.
It'd be like the Custis family. It's like Jefferson bought like crazy, and he had lots of debt.
That's
Some
why he
of it-
lost his books. That's how he lost
I
his books, remember?
Yeah. Another family that was prominent here in Washington, that intermarried with the Lees in Washington, were the Fitzhughs. And one of the names of the daughter here was Fitzhugh. She was a Fitzhugh. And as far as the Episcopal Church goes, the Episcopal Church here in America is really the Church of England here in America. And they were administrators over taxes. In other words, taxes in colonial time were paid in tobacco. The churches, that's who actually collected the tobacco and then sent it back to England. George Washington was a vestryman at the Falls Church until they started the church at the Episcopal and down near Alexandria. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, because I didn't have that little background. I knew they were from England, but thank you for that.
On the Methodist Church, that was the radicals of the time. I mean, they're not as, you can't tell the difference now. But they also had meeting houses, and whether you were enslaved or not, everyone met in the same meeting house. But what happened was they started to build churches, and then they started creating balconies. So the balconies were the color had to be. And some people walk out, and that's where anti-Zion and all that comes out of folks saying this isn't right and it's in full position. So that was all during that time, and there was a minister who married and received someone enslaved, but the church said he couldn't, and so the divide that split the church. So that's why it's called the United Methodist Church, because the church was split and then it was reunited.
Yeah, that's
If I could add to that, one of the first, the Methodist Church came here to England, from England, John Wesley, and they started out in near Baltimore, near Ellicott City. And one of the first churches was Fairfax Chapel, which was in Falls Church at what is now Oakwood Cemetery. And there was a black minister, one of the early Methodist ministers was a guy named Harry Hoosier. We always wonder where the name Hoosier comes from. But he was known for giving a sermon on, what is the name? The barren fig tree or fig vine. And that was done at Fairfax Chapel, and there's a bas relief of that actual sermon in the Oakwood Cemetery in Falls Church. But he and Richard Allen, they were Methodist ministers, but at the convention that they had in 1880s, I think it was, they were not recognized as full-fledged ministers. And we all know Richard Allen broke away from that stuff to the Lee Church, Mother Bethel in Philadelphia.
It's interesting how many of the descendants, I don't know about the Syphax family or the Carter family, but how many descendants became involved with churches as church leaders, and certainly that convention that convened to open the church or to separate and give the African American community their own churches was again one of Caroline's grandchildren, my great grandfather. So it is so much intertwined.
I'm bringing up something very important. Intervene here just quickly because we have to wrap it up. And thank Dr. Kurt for his there's a lot more research to be done. There's a lot we don't know still. And so if anyone has any additional information you want to share with us, we're open, we want to hear it. Steve Hammond back here, I want to point out Steve Hammond, a family historian of the Sycox family, has been amazing in helping us learn more about the family history. So anybody who has any information, we're looking forward to work with you too.
Pass it along.
Yes. So I want to wrap this up right now with Dr. Crew, and again, thank you very much. And we're going to finish with the final reenactment of the wedding ceremony. Hopefully, we still hope that